Greetings, everyone. I'm so delighted to be introducing this panel today. It's a magnificent panel entitled 9/11, 20 years later. And very delighted that we are joined today by an outstanding set of panelists. I'd like to thank my colleague, Jake Shapiro, Professor Jake Shapiro, for organizing the panel, Ambassador Kurtzer, General John Allen, and Razia Iqbal for joining the panel. On 9/11, 3,000 people were killed in the horrendous attacks on our country. Daughters, sons, mothers, fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers lost their lives. In the subsequent wars after 9/11, 4,500 US troops lost their lives in Iraq. Another 2,400 US troops lost their lives in Afghanistan. It would be remiss of me not to mention the deaths in the Middle East as well. 200,000 Iraqi civilians died as a result of the war in Iraq, and another 71,000 Afghani citizens have died as a result of the war there. I'd like us all to take just a few seconds as a moment of silence to honor and commemorate all of those who have lost their lives. Thank you. I want to say a word about this outstanding panel that my colleague, Professor Jake Shapiro, has organized. Since the first day we hired my colleague Jake Shapiro at Princeton, I have always been in awe and impressed with his extraordinary service to our country and his stellar research abilities. He encapsulates for us SPIA, the School of Public and International Affairs commitment to cutting-edge research and service. Ambassador Kurtzer, I am delighted to call Ambassador Kurtzer, Dan, a friend and a colleague. For several years now, he and I have been working to enhance conversations about peace on campus. He is a man of great integrity, and I am honored to know Dan as a friend, as a colleague. General Allen, SPIA is so grateful for your service to our country and to our school. For those who don't know, General Allen has been hailed as a strategic leader and battlefield leader. I'd also like to add that he is, in my opinion, and others would agree, the genius and mastermind behind ensuring that ISIL and ISIS remain contained in the Middle East, thereby contributing to our national security and helping the citizens of the MENA region. Razia Iqbal, you don't know me, but you're my morning buddy. Every morning, 9 a.m. on the BBC NewsHour, I sometimes even talk to you when the stories are a little bit painful. Not only do I admire your impeccable coverage of the news, but the passion you bring to the stories that you cover always is so touching and so inspiring. As the Dean of SPIA, on behalf of SPIA, I am so honored that this panel is happening today to commemorate 9/11 with the outstanding expertise and opinions that you'll be bringing to our audience today. Thank you. And again, I know it's going to be an outstanding panel. I have to run to another event, but I will be watching this event tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Jamal. We all congratulate you on your appointment. America is a profoundly different country since 9/11, as we know, deeply divided in our politics and deeply divided in our fundamental identity. Our politics are in a weakened state, and we are weary after 20 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. I was in Israel on 9/11, serving as the American ambassador, having arrived there just 2 months earlier. Although we in the embassy had no real serious role in the preparations for either war, my staff and I probed the views of knowledgeable Israelis to help inform the United States preparations for war, especially the war in Iraq. What we heard from Israelis and reported to Washington fell into 3 categories of advice, which drew on the Israelis' own lessons that they had learned from their experience. First, they told us that if war was necessary, to use massive, overwhelming force in order to accomplish our military objectives quickly. Second, they told us, do not occupy or stay in Iraq or Afghanistan for an extended period. as any initial support for the United States would evaporate quickly. And third, their advice was, do not attempt to transform these traditional societies into liberal Western style democracies. We're fortunate today to have two experienced experts who will examine these and other issues through the lens of their own analyses. They will look back in order to look forward. In addition to these issues, I hope they address the connection between what we do abroad and how we act as Americans towards each other and toward our institutions at home. Our friends and adversaries abroad keep a watchful eye on these issues, which in many ways are an equal, if not a greater measure of our national strength than almost anything else. I am always optimistic about America's ability to overcome adversity, to continue building a strong and equal democracy, to embrace change, and to pursue our national interests with integrity. Our speakers today will, I hope, validate my optimism. Let me introduce my speakers and turn the program then over to Jake Shapiro. John Allen currently serves as president of the Brookings Institution. He is a retired U.S. Marine Corps four-star general and former commander of the NATO International Security Assistance Force and U.S. forces in Afghanistan. General Allen served as senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense on Middle East security, as well as special presidential envoy to the Global Coalition to counter ISIL. He is the first Marine to command a theater of war, as well as the first Marine to be named Commandant of Midshipmen for the U.S. Naval Academy. General Allen is the co-author of Turning Point: Policymaking in the Era of Artificial Intelligence, as well as co-author of Future War and the Defense of Europe. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Operations Analysis from the U.S. Naval Academy, a Master of Arts in National Security Studies from Georgetown University, a Master of Science in Strategic Intelligence from the Defense Intelligence College, and a Master of Science in National Security Strategy from the National Defense University. I am a huge admirer of General Allen and proud to call him a friend. Razi Iqbal is one of the main anchors of the flagship BBC International Current Affairs radio program, NewsHour. You can tune in at 9 o'clock every morning, as we heard from Dean Jamal. She has been a BBC journalist for 3 decades, working in many different parts of the world. Next year, she will be a visiting Ferris Professor in Princeton's journalism program. It is extremely nice to welcome her to Princeton. The discussion with the two presentations will be moderated by Professor Jake Shapiro, Professor of Politics and International Affairs and Director of the Empirical Studies of Conflict Project, a multi-university consortium that compiles and analyzes micro-level data on politically motivated violence in countries around the world. He is author of The Terrorist's Dilemma: Managing Violent Covert Organizations, and co-author of Small Wars, Big Data: The Information Revolution in Modern Conflict. Professor Shapiro received his BA from the University of Michigan and his MA and PhD from Stanford University. He is a veteran of the United States Navy. Jake, over to you.
Dan, thank you for a fantastic introduction. And, I'm sure like many of those listening, my memories of the morning of 9/11 are very sharp. Just gotten off watch as command duty officer and was corresponding for the last time with a close professional mentor who was working in the wrong wing of the Pentagon on that morning. And because that day marks such a sharp change in world history in so many of our memories, I'd like to open the discussion up by asking our panelists to reflect on what they think the most important consequences of the attacks have been. And in the interest of using some ordering principle, we'll go alphabetically and begin with General Allen.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you all today. Razia, I've already offered my tribute to the many conversations that were one way with you over the years, and thank you for my education in many respects. And Ambassador Kurtzer, thank you. I am a great admirer of yours, sir. And Jake, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for this moment. Look, I was at the Naval Academy as the deputy commandant the day we were attacked, and for me, the realization that we transitioned that day to being a nation at war. And for me, fulfilling the obligation at that moment to prepare thousands of young women and men ultimately to have to participate in this war in a far-flung location. That realization was really powerful for me. What terror does, as terror did that day, is it beyond the physical damage, terror creates a prison for the minds of those who in fact have experienced it. And I think in many ways, the American people, in reaction to this moment of stark terror that killed so many innocent lives, came from nowhere. We truly were, this was truly a surprise attack. It created for the United States and for the American people, and ultimately for our allies around the world, a moment of introspection, where in so many ways, much of the next 20 years was a reaction to this paralyzing moment of terror, which created a fear, created a psychological reaction, which would play out in so many ways. It wasn't just playing out in our immediate effort to effect vengeance upon the Taliban and to eliminate Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but it played out in how we would conduct ourselves at home, how we would conduct ourselves abroad, whether we were willing to compromise what we believed to be the standards and the ethics that for many years we thought defined who we were as a people. It was a very difficult time. And it was a chilling moment for us, because I think in some respects, we didn't like what we saw when we looked at ourselves in the aftermath of this attack and over the next 20 years. And I think, as we said before we went live this afternoon, there are lots of folks, and it ought to be every single one who's tuning in this afternoon, who ought to take the time to think about what that moment of terror did when it imprisoned us in an environment of fear, fear that changed the way we saw each other, fear in the way we saw how we would govern, fear in the way that we would interact with our allies, and then fear with respect to how we would formulate and execute our foreign policy. Now, we weren't on a moment-to-moment basis afraid in that context, but I think that moment of terror shaped in so many ways how we would as a people and how we would as a country react thereafter. And we really have to take some time and think about that as we go forward.
Thank you. Razia?
Let me just add my gratitude for being part of this event. It really is a privilege to be speaking with you and with you, General Allen in particular. Thank you very much for asking me. You know, it's interesting hearing you recall where you were on 9/11, and it clearly is a signifier of the enduring power of this seminal event. Those who are old enough remember exactly where they were, and those who are not old enough have a sense of the seminal seismic nature of this event. I mean, I remember where I was. I was on maternity leave, and I was at home with my 6-month-old daughter, and subsequently glued to the television set, as many millions around the world. When I look back on not just what I thought then, but what I have thought for years and years and years since, America at that moment had the sympathy and the hearts of everyone in the world. It was a moment when everyone felt that they were Americans. So seismic and devastating and cataclysmic an event like that was. But I would say that one of the things that has really shocked me, because it's happened time and again, is the ease with which America so quickly squandered that support, that sympathy, and that sense of really wanting to support the United States. And I think that happened for all kinds of reasons, which I hope we will discuss. There were many missteps that were made. Of course, America was under attack, and of course, the administration had to respond. But I wonder whether I can ask General Allen about this idea of it being a complete surprise, because we know from the 9/11 Commission, subsequently, obviously, that the CIA and the FBI were at war. And there was intelligence that pointed to, not the specifics, obviously, but clearly things had not gone the way they should have in terms of intelligence. And the consequences domestically, of course, resulted in an enormous, profound change in surveillance in the United States, domestic surveillance and around the world too. But in terms of foreign policy, I do think that this moment, this week, if you like, now that we know that the Taliban have announced their government and we know who is in that government, I think it is a sober moment to reflect on what it was all for, what it was that America thought they were trying to do in eliminating al-Qaeda, of course, harbored by the Taliban, only to find 2 decades later that there they are, back again. And to what extent is the United States, or should the United States take responsibility for taking their eye off the ball in Afghanistan in 2002, 2003, focusing on Iraq, etc., etc. There are many things that I hope will come out in this conversation, but I think the big picture tells me that from a moment of devastation and cataclysm came real support, real sympathy, which somehow wasn't galvanized enough by the administration itself, it seems to me, that somehow it was squandered in a way that perhaps it need not have been.
And let me, if I may, come in behind Razia on this. The surprise really was the American people. The American people were stunned. And of course, the commission would eventually very clearly paint the fact that the disparate approaches, the competitive approaches to intelligence collection, analysis, production, it was so disparate and so all over the landscape that we didn't have the picture that could easily have portrayed the threat that we were facing. But the American people were stunned at the surprise and the enormity of this attack.
Indeed, it's true that up until that point, probably very few people in the country knew who al-Qaeda were.
That's right.
So Razi, I'd like to actually follow up on this. And, you know, the consequences were not just here, and we'll get to the consequences in the United States soon, but, you know, the arc of the last 20 years in the Middle East and North Africa has been in many ways extremely traumatic. There's the invasion of Iraq, the civil war there, the Arab Spring, the Arab Winter, the Syrian civil war, whose humanitarian consequences were unbelievably massive, arguably led to the current wave of populism and democratic backsliding in Europe, the emergence and defeat of ISIS, the government victory in the Syrian civil war. That is not the arc one would have certainly imagined on the morning for the next 20 years on the morning of September 11th. And so I'm curious how much of that arc you think flowed from the 9/11 attacks and the American reaction to that, or was part of that things that were going to happen anyway because of the social pressures, demographic pressures, effects of climate change and things like that in the region. Because as we think about, you know, the sequelae of the set of American decisions, which hopefully we'll have time to talk about, what has happened in the Middle East is surely some of the most important ones.
Absolutely. I mean, I think to talk about it in the way that you have as an arc is absolutely right. And there is a big instinctive part of me that has to at least go back as far as November 2001. The Taliban had been thoroughly routed by this stage. And you can argue that they were not to be trusted and that they were not in any mood to surrender, but they were willing to talk at that point. And had America paused And I understand the reasons why Washington didn't. I understand all the military reasons why that didn't happen. But in retrospect, of course, hindsight gives us 20/20 vision, doesn't it? So I wonder whether at that moment, the kind of waning days of 2001, whether it would have been completely different, whether the outcomes would have been different if Mullah Omar had been given amnesty and the Taliban had engaged in political negotiations with Hamid Karzai. And, you know, let's never forget that the Taliban are Afghans. Of course, they've been infiltrated by Al-Qaeda. There are many Arab elements of the Taliban, but that moment, I think, was the beginning of squandering of something. The idea then to distract America from really dealing with Afghanistan and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda was looking at Iraq. And I think one of the things that happened with Iraq was that the trust of the world in the institutions of the United States shifted, and that had an impact domestically too. You know, if the government was able to persuade millions of people that there were weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein had, which resulted in bombing Iraq and deposing Saddam Hussein, that did something, that shifted something, I think, in how, this is what you were talking about earlier, General Allen, the way in which America sees itself. At that moment, I think something profound happened, and I think it is connected to 9/11. I think that there is something at the heart of that particular administration, which I can only really describe as hubristic, that wasn't right. It was a profound misstep. And I think that America paid a very, very heavy price for that.
I'll offer the two observations, actually, if I may, Jake. I was on a watch in a undisclosed location the day that the issues of Abu Ghraib broke. I don't know that I've ever been more ashamed of the conduct of America at any particular moment. For those who are tuning in who don't know Abu Ghraib, it was the massive maltreatment of detainees that we had in ways that I just simply couldn't imagine that we as a people could treat our detainees and our prisoners. And I remember flying on an aircraft shortly thereafter, and someone who didn't know me from Adam sat down next to me. I believe he was probably from Pakistan, by virtue of the conversation that unfolded. And he said something really profound. He said, "What you have done will last for at least 50 years. In other words, the standard that had been set in the world by the expectation of American conduct had been violated in this moment. And it will take a long time to recover this sense of the rightness of America and the ethics of America." And the second I saw the pictures, I knew that we were in trouble. Something, as Razia said, something had happened. And the world picked up on it pretty quickly. But I said I'd say two things. The other thing I would say is that, I've always been a bit concerned as I watched the various administrations unfolding its approach to violent extremism. And when we began to talk about countering violent extremism, I was immediately concerned. Because if the strategy begins with countering a violent extremist, then we're too late. To the point of what happened in North Africa, which would be stylized as the Arab Spring or the Arab Winter, or for me, it was a tsunami because it was multiple waves of massive disruption. While in Afghanistan and in Central and South Asia and in the Middle East, Afghanistan and Iraq had its own tremors. What we saw unfolding in North Africa really didn't have that as its source. What we saw there was the long-term radicalization of populations that had no hope. They lived in areas where governance and institutions of government were massively corrupt, unresponsive to the population. The difference between the palace and the pavement, with the Arab street, the reality of the Arab street was so enormous that millions and millions of young men and women across North Africa and by and large the Middle East had no hope of ever being able to participate in a government where women's rights would be guaranteed, where hope for some economic future could be provided. And Mohammed Bouazizi, who was the fruit dealer who was so humiliated and burned himself alive, that literally created the fire which burned across North Africa, accelerated by social media, which was really the first time that we had seen this. I was at Central Command at the time. Al-Qaeda picked up on this, that this was structural failure in that part of the world, and people who had been radicalized had had enough. And Al-Qaeda was working to try to become the source of that structural failure, and they couldn't get out ahead of it. And so what we saw was where the United States and our allies had had an opportunity for years and years and years to deal with the basic causal factors that radicalize so many. We didn't. And it boiled over in 2010 and 2011. It had created the instability that we saw, which added additional despair and additional instability to what had happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so the idea that getting after the sources of instability and radicalization, as opposed to dealing with it when it's finally criminally violent, we missed that opportunity. And I think one of the things that we have to do in the aftermath of these 20 years is to begin to look around the world where people have hope for some form of future, and where if we help them on these issues of the causal factors of human misery and poverty and the effects of climate change, as you said, Jake, then we can prevent the radicalization becoming ultimately and festering into the violent extremism that then generates Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, Daesh, and others. And I think is an obligation that we have as we come out of these 20 years.
Isn't it also true that it certainly feels that way to me when you look at the Arab Spring when it reached Egypt, which of course is the most populous of the Arab countries, you know, more than 80 million people. And when the Egyptians rose up, that felt like a potentially pivotal moment for the whole of the Arab world. And it does occur to me that there is an American connection here, as there is, because America is the country that it is, the power that it has in the world, that, you know, of course, these countries are full of people who have not realized their potential, who are angry with corrupt leadership. But part of that corrupt leadership, particularly in the case of Egypt, given how powerful a country it is in the Middle East, was the support of the United States and the military connections between Egypt and the United States, the training that went on, the sale of arms. Those things are things that I think Americans should be aware of. They should think about them. They should, at the very least, be thinking about the relationship between the power that Washington has and how it wields that power in different countries. And the way in which it wields that power in Afghanistan, we've seen what can only be described as a failure of foreign policy 20 years after engaging. And there must be many Americans who are, on the one hand, relieved that America is no longer involved in Afghanistan, but also is asking themselves, especially if you are from a family or a part of the country where soldiers have been killed, why? What was it for? You know, these things are of course discussed in that way in the countries that are affected, but it's surely the case that Americans are asking themselves what it was for.
So I'd like to pick up on something that came up in both of your comments, which is the idea that certain ideas in the last 20 years have been discredited. You both spoke eloquently about the aspects with things that happened which discredited the view of America in many parts of the world. And some have looked at what happened in Egypt and said, well, for large parts of the Arab world, that discredited the idea of representative democracy as an effective means of governance. There's another set of ideas that may have been discredited over the last few years, And those are the ideas of conservative Islam and jihadism as governing principles. When you look at the terrible human costs of the wars in Iraq and Syria, the failure of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and the role that Daesh played in the horrific events in Syria, I wonder, Razi, if you could say a little bit about how that's been interpreted in places where you've spoken with people, and has that had the same kind of effect on the credibility and valence of that set of ideas that some of the other things we've talked about had with respect to other ideas?
I think most definitely it has made a huge impact. But I think before I say anything about moderate Islam, I don't think that we should forget that for all the attempts by the United States, the longevity of Al-Qaeda is something that needs to be acknowledged. It may not exist in the way that it did in 2001, but it has mutated, it has staying power. And I think that's something that is very sobering. 10 days after the Taliban came to power in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda issued a statement congratulating the movement on its great victory against the Crusader Alliance, suggesting that, well, not just suggesting, we know that the Haqqani network, which now has a presence inside the government with Sirajuddin Haqqani as the interior minister, this is a man who has a bounty of £10 million on his head. He's on the FBI most wanted list. So in that context, the Haqqani network has connections with Al-Qaeda. So they are not a spent force. The rivalries between Al-Qaeda and ISIS are interesting, but I think that what happened with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in particular is, again, it goes back to this issue of the history of Egypt and the ease with which it was possible for General Sisi to take power. The ease with which it was possible for him to put the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood in jail without the rest of the world saying, hold on a second. And maybe one of the reasons why the rest of the world didn't say, hold on 1 second, is that the narrative of extremism in Islam is the dominant one. And it's very, very difficult for people to see Islam as political Islam anyway, as anything other than potentially dangerous. And that makes it very, very difficult not to see the arc that you were talking about, Jake, as being connected. Because if you look at the research that's been done, even most recently, Pew, I think, have issued just the most fantastic piece of research looking at attitudes towards 9/11 over the last 20 years. And they have a little section in which they talk about attitudes towards Muslims. And really, it has shifted. But when you look at, even though President Bush made a speech very soon after 9/11 saying Islam is peace and made an effort, President Obama did something similar. I still think that there is a perception of, for the more than 1 billion people who practice Islam, that there is suspicion. And that's something that is to do with education and lack of education about the faith, about the distinctions made between political Islam and Islam, the faith, the religion. These are very, very simple things that I don't think people genuinely understand. They assume that if you're a Muslim, you must have some extremist bone in your body in some way. Not everybody, obviously, but I think we're talking about the general mood that 9/11 perpetuated. So is there a sense that something has shifted when it comes to moderate Islam politically? Of course. I think it's not trusted. If you look at the relationship between the United States and Iran, for instance, where political Islam was born in 1979, if you like, I do think that these are issues that this moment more than ever allows America to pause, in addition to remembering that day, remembering the people who died, honoring them, making sure that we never forget the heinous crime that was committed. I think there are so many layers that the United States can can afford to consider. It's a big country. It's a big-hearted country. And I think in that context, I also, like Ambassador, like Daniel, I think I am optimistic about the potential for learning, the potential for changing our sensibility.
So before I ask the next question, I'd like to remind the audience that we're going to shift into audience questions soon. So please post your questions in the chat for the panelists, and we'll get to some of those in a minute. But before we do, you know, General Allen, in your opening comments, you remarked on how the terror of that day has in some sense imprisoned American thinking. And in light of that, I would like to ask you to reflect a little bit on some of the dramatic changes in American life that we've seen over the last 20 years. You know, increased political polarization, underinvestment in infrastructure compared to our peers, and rising competitors, and some would argue a hollowing out of our civic institutions. And I'm curious, sir, how much you see some of those as consequences or sequelae to our response to the 9/11 attacks, as opposed to, you know, the extension of trends which were going on before 9/11 but hadn't yet surfaced.
Well, I think it's both, Jake. You know, I don't ever pass through an airport where I don't remember the title of Terry McDermott's book, The Perfect Soldiers. Every single one of us, every American, virtually everyone around the globe, if you're going to get on commercial aviation, you're reminded of how that day changed everything. So in that context, in many respects, the world of security changed for Americans, the domestic world of security. Not just in airports, but we would have, I think, very important debates about the role of surveillance for America and the capacity of our government to surveil our citizens. And those debates were very powerful. They are still underway, and we need to continue to have the debate about the rights of our citizens and the right to privacy versus the security of the state and its inherent mission to conduct surveillance necessary to protect the country and to protect the people. So surveillance is an outcome that flowed directly from 9/11. We've seen greater militarization around the country of the capacity of our security services and our police to deal with violence. That's a direct outcome of both our experience on the battlefield, the availability of equipment now to police forces, but the sense that the very quick capacity to inflict violence, to turn down criminal activity. That's a militarized state that we had not seen before in our country. And of course, it all, in the end, ends with a conversation about civil liberties. Are we a people that are our liberties protected now? Or do we have more liberties, fewer liberties? What is the state of civil society in the United States in the aftermath of 9/11? And it is changed. And if we look back at the small incremental changes, which might have at any given time been unnoticeable, in the aggregate, we're a different country and we're a different people. Now, Razia talked about, and I want to talk about this, and that's the reaction to Islam as a faith and Muslims as a people. The day of the attack in my world, at the United States Naval Academy, one of my first instructions as we learned the source of the attack was to call in my leadership and to ensure that the Muslim and Arab midshipmen in the brigade of midshipmen were protected, that we would not permit in the aftermath of this attack a direct assault upon those young men who were in the brigade at that moment. And I've worried over the years, because I would ultimately serve on the ground in Bosnia and in Iraq and in Afghanistan, where I became very enamored with the faith of Islam and Muslims. And we went through a lot of hard times together. I became very concerned about the attack in the United States on both the faith and the people that practice Islam. As Razia said, and Brookings, in fact, produced by Bill Galston, an excellent piece on the aftermath, the societal aftermath today of 9/11, where there was an immediate fear of Islam and an immediate mistrust of Muslims in the United States. That's actually grown over time. And it's been a great concern of mine because, in fact, so much of our population, it's not a large percentage, but it's not an insignificant percentage of our population, both worships in the faith of Islam and their origins are as Muslims. And we owe them the very same respect, the very same rights, the very same protection as any other member of our society. And sadly, for all of us, in the 2015 presidential campaign and the run-up to the election in 2016 and in the aftermath of the last administration, Islam and Muslims have been vilified to a point where it has created quite a substantial reaction by the American population. And it's something we, again, as Americans, in the aftermath of this 20 years, in the time that has passed since the attack, we need to ask ourselves the question, what do we stand for? What as a nation do we stand for? Wave after wave of immigrants have come to this country over the years, and so many of them were fleeing something horrific. Yet in the end, were embraced, often traumatically or often through evolution, but were embraced and made the country better in each case. But we continue to come back to this issue about Islam and Muslims and vilify them in ways that, first, are not deserved, and second, I think runs counter to everything we stand for as a people and certainly as a nation. And I think in the end, as I said, real terror has as its objective capturing the minds of those who are the subject of terror and inflicting fear on those minds. And in so many ways, I think we have been afraid. And I don't mean that we're cowards. Americans are seldom accused of being cowards, but we have been afraid of those things we don't understand. And we've been fearful at home of each other. And in the last 4 years, 5 years or so, this kind of vilification of elements of our population have played right into the hands of the white supremacists, who, in my mind, are one of the greatest national security threats to the United States. Not just the Chinese, if you want to call it that, or some other threat overseas. We can handle all those threats, but that enemy is within. And that kind of fear mongering has polarized the American population in many ways. And I worry about that. It's also created a crisis of confidence in our leadership, the judgment and the decisions of our leadership and our institutions as well, as we have seen one administration after another attempt to come to grips with the aftermath of this moment and this attack. And I also think in our foreign policy, where if our policy was largely shaped by an intent on countering terror, the global war, so-called global war on terror, but countering terror, the old saying is, if your problems all look like a nail, then the solutions typically take the form of a hammer. And I think we, as Razia said, we've missed so many opportunities to harvest the benefit of the sympathy of the world, to go after those issues that I talked about, which is those radicalizing issues that, if we had come together as a world, dealt with the immediate threat of Al-Qaeda, later the Islamic State, but came together as a world ultimately to go after those radicalizing features to change the quality of life of so many people around the world, to prevent them from becoming extremists and ultimately becoming violent extremists. We really missed that opportunity. And whether it was the subsequent attack on Iraq or the missed opportunities in other places around the world, this is something we really have to think long and hard about. And I don't know, in the aftermath of the catastrophe that we've just experienced in the last 2 weeks of August, how this will affect this administration and following administrations on the potential for American intervention overseas, when in fact there might be a very important reason why Americans might have to intervene or lead some coalition to take action. And I worry about the willingness of the United States now to do that, not because it's not a good idea. You know, we should always consider those realizations or those reasons very carefully, but because we are so traumatized in the short term by virtue of what happened over the last 2 weeks.
I wonder if I can just jump in there, just to broaden it out just a little bit from what you were talking about, General Allen, about China, because it's quite clear that this administration has decided that China is the greater threat. And while that may be true in all kinds of ways, as well as Russia in all kinds of cyber ways that we already know about, that there is the flip side of it is that, of course, China looks on at the catastrophe of Afghanistan.
Sure.
And the Black Lives Matter, the January the 6th insurrection on Capitol Hill, and looks at America and says, it's an empire that is no longer an empire. It's crumbling. So there are narratives that are at war. There are competing narratives, which I think make it all the more incumbent on people inside the administration to think very, very carefully about their priorities. And because there will be threats coming from all sorts of different areas, ones that we can't even predict, that we know nothing about yet. And I just want to end on one tiny little microcosm of the bigger picture that we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes or so, which is that when you look at something like Guantanamo Bay that is still open, much reduced in terms of the inmates who are in there, obviously many people will defend its existence in 2002. But if you look at the makeup of the people inside the Taliban government, there are people there who were in Guantanamo. And you are then looking at the possibility that the US Secretary of State in this administration or another may be sitting across the table with someone who has been incarcerated in Guantanamo Bay. And they can easily turn around and say, do not lecture us about values, do not lecture us about civil liberties, do not lecture us about equality. And I think that is the paradox of the mistakes that have been made. It really does make it very, very difficult for the Americans to reshape the narrative, to take it by the scruff of its neck and say, this is what we believe in, and we're going to persuade you that we still do.
And I've got to come in right behind that, because that's a really important point. The so-called great power competition, at its very heart, the competition is a competition of values. And this administration has embraced the values of commitment to human rights. Chinese don't worry about that. The Russians don't worry about that. So much of the world, which is increasingly autocratic or authoritarian, they're not worrying about that. And so here is that opportunity that Razia has just mentioned. Here is the opportunity for this administration, as it has just learned a terrible lesson about decision-making on the ground in Afghanistan. If it truly is committed to human rights, and it truly is committed to great power competition, at the very heart and the soul of that competition must be our commitment to the values that we have traditionally stood for, and now start to live those values in a way that permits us to recover the ground that we've lost over the last 20 years. You're muted again, Jake.
I'd like to bring in a question from the audience here, which touches on this. And we had a couple questions. I'm going to try to merge those, but we identified and discussed radicalism and political violence as things that happen when people are pushed into extreme poverty and have no hope. And that raises a set of twinned questions. One is, given that, why is the administration so adamant right now about not allowing the Afghan government, the current government, to access their own funds, which will guarantee a humanitarian crisis in the near future? And the second aspect of that is whether there is a place to give the Taliban a chance to govern their people, the state they've changed and want to be legitimate. So those two questions seem to tap the same concept, which is what is the value at stake in the next 6, 12, 18 months in Afghanistan?
Well, I think it's actually too early to tell. They just announced their cabinet yesterday or today. I'm not even sure what day it is, frankly. Chinese immediately applauded it, offered them some amount of food aid and I guess Sinovacs. Almost any minute we expect that the Chinese, almost certainly to be followed by the Russians, will recognize the government. But I also think that the United States and other of the similarly minded states, and I think 100 countries have already signed a communique that calls on the Taliban to respect the rights of women and minorities. And I think that the idea of withholding certain of the Taliban's resources to ensure that their behavior, in fact, respects the rights of women, respects the rights of minorities, that seems to set at least the conditions or the expectation that if these resources are released, those resources won't immediately be employed by Siraj Haqqani in the Ministry of Interior to crack down even more on women who are marching, or to go after the Hazaras or the Kuchis, and to make their lives increasingly miserable. So I can understand the rationale about withholding those resources until if you will, the dust has settled. But as Razia said, look, we've got Gitmo veterans that will be at the table. And in many respects, we have a reset of the organization and the palace in Kabul that set the conditions for Al-Qaeda to strike us on 9/11, 20 years almost to the day. And I think I can understand why our administration and other administrations are willing to wait to see before they're willing to release resources, because the reality is the Taliban, in the period that the women of Afghanistan called the darkness before, from 96 to 01, there's no such thing as a Taliban 2.0 or a Taliban 3.0. There's a Taliban 1.0. And by the way, a lot of them are back in business. And I think we should be all very, very concerned about what Afghanistan, the trajectory that it is on. And I can understand why we will hold resources for some period of time to get a sense of whether their behavior will coincide with their words, which is, as they say, they'll respect the rights of women and ultimately minorities. And track record already isn't very good. So I'll stop there.
I think also that there is a big difference between diplomatic recognition, and allowing the black and white flag of the Taliban to fly in an embassy in Washington, and perhaps talking to those potential very solid allies of the United States, certainly in the past, such as Pakistan. Pakistan is already flying in aid to Afghanistan. Obviously, there are all kinds of problems with Pakistan's involvement with Afghanistan, and now's not the time to go into that. But Qatar as well has been flying in aid to Afghanistan on a daily basis. It is possible to try and help not just the immediate humanitarian situation, which is dire in Afghanistan, but also try and find ways of engaging in civil society that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to give full diplomatic recognition to a government that is clearly profoundly problematic. And I think that there are clever people in the United States who understand statecraft that will make it possible to help the people of Afghanistan in all kinds of ways, that will make it possible for the people of Afghanistan to not feel that they have been abandoned. People talk, today, the airport was open again, and I think a plane was allowed to leave with some Americans on the plane. And I just think it's sobering to remind everyone who's listening and watching that there are 38 million Afghans who have no possibility of leaving that country. Some of them want to, some of them don't, but they have to stay. And I think there are ways of helping them.
And there are many NGOs.
Yeah.
Very capable NGOs still on the ground that the Taliban permitted to stay. And that is a means ultimately to deal with the humanitarian crisis, Jake, that you mentioned that could arise at the diplomatic level as we freeze assets. There's still very capable NGOs from many different countries, Pakistan as well, that have the capacity to be quite helpful.
So I want to end, there's one last question, which is just so good that if our panelists are willing to take one more, I'd like to ask. And the question is really that taps on something that you raised earlier, General Allen. It's that the citizens of the US in some ways have lost faith in political governing institutions at large. And in reading the things that have come out about the war in Afghanistan, the Afghan papers, if you dig into their source, the cigar reports, they're becoming aware that the institutions meant to guide us diplomatic and militarily failed in some ways. Privileged insiders at state intelligence agencies and DoD understood the failure at large throughout the war effort. And many people admitted in private those failures over the course of the last 20 years. And so the question from this person is, how do we build a culture within those institutions to restore Americans' faith in the institutions? How do we develop a culture there that's candid in nature and that can build back that trust in the institutions that we rely on?
Well, I think it comes from the preparation of those who would lead. First, it comes from those who we would select to lead through the political process. And sadly, that process doesn't deliver necessarily. Those individuals are either sufficiently experienced in leading ethically and morally, or have sufficient background in the particular issues to be able to make the judgments necessary for effective leadership. So it's who we select. It's how we ultimately groom our leaders as they get older. I had an opportunity a few minutes ago to meet with 4 young graduate students at Princeton in the mentorship program. Look, I came away so pleased and so optimistic that this young man and these 3 young women, they're on a trajectory to be leaders in their sectors, whatever it may be, or the country to which they return. And I was so pleased to see that this institution, Princeton, the program that they're in, their personal objectives are to be ethical leaders who can make the decisions that are not just for the benefit of the American people and the United States, but for the benefit of the world community. God, that was impressive. And it left me with a sense of optimism that, frankly, in the last several weeks, I haven't had much optimism. But I do believe that institutions like this one, I'm not just patronizing Princeton, institutions like this one and others around the country, and there are many around the country, that are committed to creating women and men of character who will dedicate their lives to leadership, whether it's in the private sector or in civil society or in government. This is how we ultimately will resolve these issues. It didn't start on last Tuesday and it's not going to end next Tuesday. It's going to be a long-term issue, but we've got to commit ourselves as a country to begin to turn this around.
Well, on that note of hope and optimism, I'd like to invite everyone who we can't hear, unfortunately, to join me in thanking our panelists, Ambassador Kurtzer, General Allen, Razia. Thank you so much for joining us today for a fascinating discussion. We look forward to many more conversations with you all in the future.
Honored to be with you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much indeed. It was great to be with you. Thanks.